Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take another look at our vsftpd server, or our file transfer protocol, or FTP server on our CentOS virtual machine. This video is part of a larger series of videos that focuses on the use of Oracle VM VirtualBox Manager, as well as our CentOS installation, and focuses on networking. So to begin with, what we want to do in this video is we want to set up the user account that will ultimately be used to access our FTP server. In an earlier video, I demonstrated how you would go about just simply connecting to the server using an existing account. However, that is not the account that we ultimately want to use, particularly because of the fact that it is essentially acting as our administrator or our root user. The idea is that perhaps you have a user maybe in another building or across the country that needs to have access to your FTP server for the purposes of uploading or downloading files, and you don't necessarily need that user to log on interactively. In the next couple of videos, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on how to configure our FTP server to use that account to be able to then log in for, again, the purposes of uploading or downloading files. So to begin with, you want to go ahead and log in this time around with the root account. It is not completely necessary that you use the root account, but for a little bit of variety, I'm actually going to show you how to do this two different ways. In the video, I'm going to demonstrate how we can create the user interactively using the GUI tools in our CentOS installation. And in the comments for this video, I'm also going to give you the command line operations that would accomplish the exact same thing. Essentially, it's a two-step process. The first thing is we want to create the user, and then the second portion of the process is that we want to create the file system and the subfolders that the user is going to use when they log into our FTP server. So the first thing that you want to do is go to your activities, and you're going to go to System, and we want to create then a new user. So you could select then users, and we're simply going to go ahead and call this user an FTP user, but I'm going to do this with essentially a domain prefix, if you would, so I can identify who the user is and what domain they might be access to. Perhaps you are managing groups of machines. But the idea here is that I'm going to identify it just simply by my initials, and I'm going to call this one GCM FTP user. And again, just for our sake here, I'm going to put a dash in here so you could separate the domain from the username. Now, we need to set up a password for this user. I'm going to keep this one pretty simple. Also, for the purposes of later videos, I'm going to encourage you to use a password that is not your email password or your banking account password, because we are going to use Wireshark to attempt to capture this password when it is sent from the client to the server. So in other words, just use a password here that you are not committed to. And again, we want to enter it in a second time and go ahead and add. And then what we want to do is we want to take a look at the changes to the system that have been made here. And to do that, we can go over and start our next step by looking at our file manager. And if we go to other locations and computer, home, you'll see that now we have a second user folder created. There was our initial account that we were using to manage the computer. In other words, that was the one that we were sudoing to install software, do updates, etc. But now we have this second user that we are identifying specifically as an FTP user, and we need to set some of the permissions on the folder such that they can access it using the FTP server the way that we will ultimately configure it. And if you recall, in an earlier video, I mentioned something about restricting or hardening our FTP server. We'll get to that in another video, but for right now, what we want to do is we want to make sure by going to properties that the appropriate permissions are set on this folder. And so to begin with, we want to start off by restricting where they can actually update or add or upload files. And what we want to do is on the base directory, we simply want to select that they can access files. And for the group, then again, just simply access files. We don't want them to necessarily have any write permissions to their base directory. Remember that this user, this GCM-FTP user, is not intended to ever log on interactively. In other words, they're only going to use the FTP server. So if we drill into that GCM-FTP user folder, we want to go ahead and create two subfolders. The first one we're going to call uploads, and the idea is that our FTP user is going to use this as a place to drop files, maybe for instance, configuration files that they wish to upload to you, or perhaps part of an IoT project where this account logs on and pushes data to your server. But basically, they need permissions to be able to modify and update files inside this uploads folder. And to accomplish that, what we're going to do is we're going to change now the permissions for this particular folder. It's a two-step process. Again, we want to change who the owner of this folder is. And we see here, if we select our GCM FTP user, you can go ahead and leave this as create and delete files. And likewise for the group, again, we want to go ahead and select that GCM-FTP user. And for others, I can simply leave this alone for right now. I'm just going to acknowledge that they can access files. This basically will make it easier for any other administrators or users of the local computer than to access files that are dropped in this folder. Now, we can go ahead and close this one out. Actually, let's go back real quick and make one more change. We're going to go ahead and be a little bit less aggressive on this. We're going to go ahead and change the group, the GCM-FTP user, to be able to create and delete files. And then in the downloads folder, which we're going to create here, we can be a little more aggressive, meaning that we don't want them to be able to modify the files. So in this case, for the downloads folder, we again select the correct users. So the owner is going to be GCM-FTP user. In this case, then we only want that user to be able to access files, and likewise do the same thing under the group. And again, we can simply leave it as access files for this particular folder. The idea is that maybe you post a file in this folder for our GCM FTP user to get or to ultimately download, in which case you don't necessarily want them to be able to modify anything in the downloads folder. Okay, so to recap, the uploads folder is essentially where they're going to be able to put files or to be able to post the files or ultimately update this folder. And in the downloads folder then is where they're going to get files and be able to ultimately download the files using their FTP client. Now, again, I'm going to leave the command line equivalent in the comments, but the process is essentially the same. You have to add the user first, and then you make sure that the folder structure is correct, not only the structure itself, but also that the permissions are correct. Now, in a later video, what we're going to do is we're actually going to modify our vsftpd.conf file then to leverage this user's subfolder. And then even later, we're actually going to restrict this user's ability to even log on interactively, because again, we do not want the FTP user to necessarily be logging on directly to our server. Rather, they should only be using our FTP server. So as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.